criticism that you had was probably along the lines of, listen, this study's been retracted. Why are you talking about it? It doesn't count. It's not science. Well,
Right.
listen, the reason why it was retracted was proven to be wrong in another publication published by myself and by a study published by myself and Dr. Russell Blaylock. But I'll get to that in a minute. So we had about 4,000 patients, 561 of which over 10 years were not vaccinated, and others had variable levels of vaccination. You don't
So let
have,
me just stop you and explain. Dr. Paul Thomas was a pediatrician in Oregon,
yeah,
and he and you decided to take all of his files over what 20, 30 years of practice
10 years.
and 10 years, I thought it was longer, and look at the non-vaccinated versus the lightly vaccinated versus the vaccinated.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty demanding study because you have to go through thousands of files. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, the ask for the data actually came from the medical board. They said if you're not vaccinating patients, then you have to show us that your unvaccinated patients are not less healthy than your vaccinated patients. And so Paul and I were in a meeting, and he said, "Hey, you do science. I have 10 years of data. Would you like to do a study?" And I said, "Yeah, let's do the study." And what I found was just even looking at the data. I mean, they say, well, there's something wrong with the method. He came up with a new method. He was looking at the relative incidence of coming to the doctors for a complaint, a medical complaint, not a well-child visit. How often do kids have to go because they're sick, basically, while that translates. And you know what? You don't need my sophisticated, not too sophisticated. A sixth grader can understand that method. Um, to understand that out of 561 unvaccinated kids, there were zero cases of ADHD.
Wow.
And in the rest of the population, it was about half the national rate. So it's not rocket science, actually. I'm very smart, thank you very much, but this is not rocket science. This is very simple. And so we looked at it and we saw condition after condition after condition that the vaccinated kids' parents were bringing them to the doctor because they were sick with something like ear infection. Moms know all about this, right? Any kind of respiratory infection. That was a surprise. Anemia was off the charts for these kids that are vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. And so we have a very, very good study. It never should have been retracted. The reason why it was retracted because after 250,000 people read the study, one person wrote in and said, "Aha, I know what's going on. There's a bias in the data." Without any data of their own, they said the kids that are not vaccinated just aren't going to the well-child visits. So that must be a bias in the data. The journal retracted it. Paul and I wrote back a couple of times and said, no, they're wrong, but they kept it retracted. So in the second study with Dr. Blaylock, we actually published the data that showed that the vaccinated kids were skipping out, their parents were skipping out on the well-child visits more than the unvaccinated kids. Why? Because the unvaccinated families were not afraid of Dr. Paul and the doctors at his practice because he's an ethical physician. If you hashtag on Twitter ethical physician, you'll find all the good doctors out there. They're really that I know
Right.
of. And so use that hashtag if you know of an ethical physician. It's important that we help people find them. But anyway, the second question, and this is Dr. Russell Blaylock's credit because he asked a good question. He said, well, what about the kids? You didn't do this in the original study. I was surprised. What about the kids that were vaccinating? And then the parents decided to stop. What happens to their number of times that they have to go to the doctor? And guess what? The people who stop vaccinating get healthier. They stop having to go to the doctor. And I just
Right.
want to clear that the thing that you were talking about, Catherine, for the viewers, was not the vax done vax study. The thing on the Solari report was the economics of it,
Right.
the paid incentives for vaccinating, and that's why doctors would go along with it. That's evil. That's really wrong to give people. If you give people more vaccines, we will your incentives go up. And now we know if you understand my study with Dr. Thomas and my other study with Dr. Blaylock, which you should really read both to understand it, then you understand that the vaccines are, creating ill health among the pediatric population, which generates even more revenue for the practices. So you
Right. So
create
I
the
wanted
solution
to
and solve the
mention,
problem, right?
right. Thomas calculated